This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, former House Speaker Joe Mavretic, political analyst and also lobbyist Jeanne, and John Hood from the John Locke Foundation. Well, as we head into the Christmas holiday, we've got an interesting show for you, including the latest on 2 lawsuits against the state. The first over using public money for private schools, the second over the voter ID lawsuit. We'll also discuss where things stand on restructuring the Department of Commerce. And as usual, we'll ask our panelists to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. The 2013 session of the General Assembly passed a bill offering opportunity scholarships, better known as vouchers, to low-income families to attend private schools starting in the fall of 2014. Now, the NC Association of Educators, the NC Justice Center, the North Carolina School Boards Association, and others have gone to court saying these vouchers are a bad public policy, take money away from public schools, and more importantly, violate our state constitution, which says in Article 9, Section 2, the General Assembly shall provide by taxation and otherwise for a general and uniform system of free public schools, which shall be maintained at least 9 months in every year, and wherein equal opportunities shall be provided for all students. I want to ask this question of all of our panelists. Plaintiffs say the funds are to be used exclusively for free public schools. Tell us if you think the vouchers are in fact under that definition constitutional and what you think is going to happen with this lawsuit. Jeanne Bonds, I'll start with you.
I think the vouchers are unconstitutional because the Constitution says a uniform system of free schools. The vouchers can be used for private schools, so we're using public money in private schools, so I think it will be unconstitutional.
John, what do you think?
There's absolutely no prohibition in the Constitution for taxpayer money being spent on private education. It's been going on for many years, for decades in North Carolina. No one's ever challenged the constitutionality of it because it won't work. Most of the lawsuit is simply an argument against vouchers, which is perfectly fine. It's just not an argument that needs to be done in a courtroom, because in the court you're not asking whether you like the policy or not, you're asking whether it violates the Constitution. It's very specific. The bill authorizes money be appropriated to the State Education Assistance Authority, not to the public school fund. So all the arguments about how you can't use public school dollars because of the free and because of the uniform clause and not the uniformity clause is completely irrelevant to the policy being debated.
Chris.
Well, I think there's a real question about the constitutionality, and NC Spin panelist Bob Orr agrees. He's the lawyer for the School Boards Association, so we're not talking about folks who don't know what they're talking about. And there's several other aspects to both these lawsuits. One would be that the State Board of Education should oversee the schools of North Carolina, which is also in the Constitution. It won't be overseeing these schools at all. So I think it's a bad policy, and we should have that argument, and I hope we will. But I also think there are real constitutional questions.
Joe?
Well, any bill passed by the General Assembly is a law, and it's constitutional until it goes to the courts and they declare it's not constitutional. So I think we have to wait on that one. But I think it's we have to follow the bouncing ball. Let's assume that it is not constitutional. Well, that means that the money that currently goes to North Carolina students who go to private colleges and universities also is not constitutional. So then what are you going to do with that money? Well, easily, you're going to put it in the budget, and you're going to use that to give a tax credit to every family in North Carolina who sends their kids to private schools and to homeschool. Now, the bottom line on all of this ping pong is who ultimately loses? Well, it's free and reduced lunch.
All right. Jeanne, back to you. The supporters for the vouchers say that this is a way to give poor families an opportunity to be able to have some choice in the schools that their students attend. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, and I know John's done a lot of research on this, there are a lot of places where there are low-income families, and the private schools that would be available to them exceed the cost of the amount they're given for the vouchers, because you have to take into account uniforms and transportation, meals, and all these other things that they would get in the public schools that they don't get with those schools. So that's what I would tell those families.
John, Chris talked about Bob Orr and working on behalf of the School Board Association. he used the public purpose for private public money for private purpose argument, but he also said that part of the rationale from the school boards was that these private schools don't have to adhere to any substantive educative standards or either non-discrimination standards. How do you respond to that?
Again, those are all very interesting arguments that would be relevant if it hasn't already been decided many times before about relevant cases. I mean, for example, as Joe alluded to, there's money currently going, state tax dollars go to private colleges that only admit women. There's state tax dollars that go for Smart Start and More at 4, which is a kind of a voucher program that goes to church-run daycare centers. These are policy arguments. They are not really legal.
Chris, former Superintendent Mike Ward said that this was taking money away from the public schools. Help me with the math here. We currently spend about $5,600 per student in public education in North Carolina. The voucher is for $4,200. It looks to me like the state would be saving money instead of
Well, I think part of the argument is a long-term one, which is the voucher is not going to stop at $4,200, and it's not going to stop at the $10 million they passed. But here's my problem right now, putting the philosophical objection I have aside. This is the least accountable state government program I've ever seen. And folks who are all talking about accountability, there's 700 schools on the list who are eligible. Some of them, we found one that has 3 students and 1 teacher that meets in a basement that's never been inspected. Nobody knows what they teach. There are schools that have incredibly odd reputations. You're going to hear more and more about these as we go along. There's nobody looking at these schools. There's nobody finding out where's the money going. And you can say that it's all up to the parents, but some parents are sending their kids to these schools anyway, and they're teaching crazy kids. They're teaching kids crazy things that we shouldn't be subsidizing.
All right, we'll be talking about it more, I'm sure, before this lawsuit is adjudicated. You can watch NC Spin anytime you want. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and click on the YouTube button on the right side of the page. We post each week's show on Friday, so view us anytime you like. And while at ncspin.com, be sure to sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, Spin Cycle. You can follow us also, NC Spin, on Facebook and on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. Let's keep the conversation going with ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, Twitter at NC Spin Tweets, and Spin Cycle. We look forward to hearing from you. When we come back, another lawsuit over voter ID.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Fishing isn't just part of my job, it's my life. It's a part of who I am and how I was raised in eastern North Carolina. It's how I put food on the table for my family. It's hard work, but I love what I do. There's something special about knowing that my long, hard days help feed friends, neighbors, and people in North Carolina. It might not be glamorous, but fishing is my life.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
We now return to NC Spin.
There are 3 lawsuits resulting from the voter ID bill passed by the General Assembly this year. The plaintiffs were hoping the lawsuit could be heard before next year's elections, but a federal judge ruled the case could not be heard until July 2015, saying the issue is far too complicated for both the plaintiffs and the states to assemble their cases before the election. But Judge Joy Peak did say she would hear motions to prevent the changes from taking effect until after the case is resolved. Question 1 to all: what are the chances an injunction will be issued to prevent the changes from taking place? John, I'll start with you on this one.
I don't think it's inconceivable, but it's not likely. We have seen in other states where there were changes, voter ID changes or other things, where judges did intervene and put an injunction. But that's typically not because they argued against or for the merits. They said there wasn't enough time. There was a provision that a legislature passed and the election was a few months later or 3 months later, and they said that's not the time. That argument's not going to work here. They have to have something else to justify the injunction. I think that might be tough.
Jeanne, what do you think about the injunction?
Well, I'm thinking they might do the injunction specifically because of the photo ID part of it. And even though they do have a time period to implement it, I think because of the numbers of people it affects and because it's still a little bit unclear about how that process is going to work, getting the free IDs, that they might put an injunction because of that.
I think if you look at the federal district judge's record, that it's a crapshoot either way. I don't think anybody knows where she's going to come down. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I think that 15 months for both sides to prepare is obscene. If you can't get ready in a couple of months on an issue like this, something's wrong with your attorneys.
Chris?
I think it's possible. I'm not sure I would put overwhelming odds on it, but I do think it's possible. And remember, the voter ID is one part of the massive changes. This was a 50-some-odd page bill. Voter ID was 3 pages. So they made changes to voting laws that took literally 50 pages to make. It is very complicated.
Joe, back to what you were saying and talking about. Let's assume that there is no injunction. The case is not going to be heard until July 2015. So we're going to hold the 2014 elections under these new laws. How difficult is it going to be to go back and revert back to some other form?
Well, I don't think it'll be that difficult. What I like about going ahead without the injunction is I would like to see how catastrophic these new regulations are for voter turnout. I suspect that it's a whole lot less, has a whole lot less impact than what we've been led to believe.
Jeanne, the new law contains changes in the voting laws, and of course the plaintiffs say that this violates the U.S. Voting Rights Act of 1964. The Supreme Court ruled this summer, however, that North Carolina does not have to get pre-clearance before making changes to voting. What impact is that going to have on the judge's decision?
Well, I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court sent that back to Congress. Congress obviously isn't going to deal with that provision, so I think it has a major effect on how this lawsuit comes out.
Now, Eric Holder announced, the U.S. Attorney General announced he was going to intervene in suing North Carolina over this lawsuit. Of course, he also said he was going to sue Texas, and my understanding was he didn't win there. What impact does it have for the U.S. Attorney General to be involved in this lawsuit, John?
Well, that's in fact partly why you were asking earlier about the effects of the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court decision didn't say that North Carolina wasn't subject to the relevant sections of the Voting Rights Act. It simply said it wasn't subject to pre-clearance. So it doesn't prejudge the outcome of the case. The federal intervention, I think, is actually not in the interest of the plaintiffs.
John, Chris, I want to ask you, Roy Cooper, of course, is the North Carolina Attorney General. He has spoken out very, very vocally against this law. Now, both the governor and the legislature have lawyered up here.
Right.
Who's going to be representing North Carolina?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think the Attorney General has a role. Their private counsels have a role. I think there'll be a lot of attorneys at the table.
Maybe that's why it's going to take so many months to get this going.
That's the 15 months.
There you go.
Well, actually, a lot of the delay or the time period is involved in discovery. There's going to be a huge amount of discovery on this issue because they have to find some evidence I mean, in fairness to the plaintiffs and the defendant, the plaintiffs are making an argument about intent that they don't yet have information about. And part of discovery in their minds is we will find that information. Discovery is going to take a long time.
All right, after these messages, we're going to talk about restructuring the Department of Commerce.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
It's true. Farming is different than it was 50 years ago. We know consumers have questions about how our food is grown today. North Carolina livestock farmers want you to know that they're using the most responsible and caring farming practices to feed our state.
ncanimalag.com.
The North Carolina Medical Society is committed to a healthier North Carolina. We feel as an organization representing over 14,000 physicians that we have a responsibility and an obligation to help our citizens become more healthy. And by doing this, we want to help educate them about ways in which they need to keep keep themselves healthy through good nutrition, exercise, and maintaining a healthy lifestyle. These ingredients will help not only individual citizens become and maintain a healthier outlook on their lives, but also help contribute to having a healthier state.
Where do you go when you need to know? A&C makes it easy for you to get the information you need to make well-informed public policy decisions. Our members are industry leaders who are ready to share their industry-specific insights with you. Want to hear both sides of the story? A&C members can tell you. Just use the A&C member directory as your guide or call us directly. A&C members have the knowledge, expertise, and perspective you need to create public policies that are good for North Carolina. We are ready for your call.
We now return to NC Spin.
One of Governor Pat McCrory's legislative priorities was to get permission to restructure the Department of Commerce. And a bill was passed in the closing hours of the 2013 session that appeared to give him authority to do so. But now some lawmakers are saying that wasn't the case and want to know more before the reorganization goes further. Senator Harry Brown, vice chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, said, "I think we made it pretty clear to them to get the public-private partnership started and no more than that. I think that was the intent." Question one to all. Should Commerce Secretary Decker and Governor McCrory go ahead with the restructuring, or must they wait until the legislature reconvenes in May? Chris, we'll start with you.
This seems like a pretty clear one. I mean, part of this restructuring is transferring 60-some-odd jobs, $18 million from state government to a private nonprofit where it's not clear yet what role the taxpayers have, what ability we have on open records and all the rest of it. I think it's clear that the most the governor and Secretary Decker can do is come up with all these details in a framework and ask the legislature to pass a bill, which they did not pass last time.
Joe, you were House Speaker. What do you think?
Well, I think that it's going to take probably until May to get all the nuances worked out in the first place. I think they ought to go ahead with the planning and what they're trying to do. I see a little bit of this Senate snickering around the edges one more time. Yeah, but it's Republican against Republican.
Not snicker.
Jeanne, what's going to happen here? Should they go ahead with this restructuring?
I think they should keep planning. The specific bill didn't pass the legislature. It was a pretty vague provision in the budget, and it's going to take them that long to plan it.
John?
It'll be resolved. I mean, by the time they're really ready to implement it, the bill will be passed.
All right, but Secretary Decker says she's been conducting interviews and is getting ready to hire the executive for this nonprofit organization and is moving full forward ahead with that. Chris, should she?
Well, I'm not sure. Apparently she's interviewed a couple of people have not taken the job. She made that clear to one of the legislative study committees that she thought she had two people. She said she couldn't get them down the aisle. She had them in the church and couldn't get them down the aisle. So apparently there is some reservation from some of the candidates themselves about whether or not the legislature is going to approve it, what actually the roles are. There's plenty of questions unanswered about this. If I was the administration, I would move slowly until they got the legislature on board.
Jeanne, there's been some suggestion that all of this uncertainty over this might be hurting our economic development efforts. Secretary Decker says she doesn't think that it is. Do you?
Well, yes. Flashback the Charlotte airport ordeal, which I was going to say anybody who's applying for the job better do a Google search and see what's happening on that front before they take this position. But I do think it hurts because it presents uncertainty and confusion, which is the theme of our news media coverage.
You alluded to the fact that there were going to be employees that were going to be transferred from public status over to the private partnership. We understand there's going to be as many as 61. Now, they're saying that it could save the state as much as $1.5 million a year in payroll. She's saying it's going to cost $1,800,000 in severance payments. Have you ever heard of anything like this taking place in the state?
Well, absolutely. It takes place every day in the private sector. So
I've said in the state public sector.
Oh, in the public sector. Well, no, and the reason is that we don't do a very business-like job of running state government.
John, talking about the economic development aspect of this, the big buzz around, of course, is over the big elephant hunt going on with Boeing aircraft and whether or not North Carolina can even compete. We understand the incentives might amount to more than $1 billion if we were to be successful. Should we be in this hunt?
Well, I don't like the incentive grabbing, and I think that North Carolina would not end up spending that amount of money on incentives if that was what happened, because Other states that don't have some of the same amenities are having to offer more to be in the game. Now, frankly, I think the state of Washington is still the primary competitor because it's where most of the existing Boeing work is done.
It's also where the unions are.
Well, that's the point. They're trying to get the unions to cave on some things. The unions may not, in which case North Carolina is an option.
That's why South Carolina got the Dreamliner plant. Should we be in this hunt, Jeanne?
We should probably be in the hunt, but I don't think we're going to get it. I mean, I think there's some places that are, but we should certainly be out there trying for
All right, so at the end of the day, going back to the topic at hand, at the end of the day, where are we with this restructuring? Should Secretary Decker go ahead with the planning, as you say,
Absolutely.
and not do anything about transferring these 5 divisions until the legislature blesses it, or what?
Well, I don't understand how the governor would have constitutional authority to take jobs out of state government and in effect state funding and give it to a private entity. I thought we're all against that, and so I think the legislature has to pass the bill. The other big issue we haven't talked about, there's a blatant conflict of interest on this nonprofit. John Lasseter, who raises anonymous corporate money for the governor's PAC, in effect, or governor's 501c4, is also negotiating incentives. We can't have that. Somebody's got to do something about that.
Tom, I think also everybody's overlooking the function of GovOps. And what they can and cannot do between sessions.
Well, GovOps can't bless this.
Oh, yes, they can.
They can bless it.
They can bless it. Can they make it happen?
Absolutely, they
can.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. He's talking about the joint subcommittee for governmental operations, the joint House and Senate subcommittee.
Absolutely.
Wow, interesting. When we come back after these messages, we're going to ask our panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
You trust your family physician to care for you and your family. We treasure that trust and are committed to providing the best care possible for all North Carolinians. It's time for Medicaid reform, but not without input from North Carolina's family physicians. Medicaid reform will impact health care for all of us. Tell state leaders you want your physician involved. We need Medicaid reform that's good for North Carolina. To sign our petition of support, visit rnchealthcare.com.
North Carolina is a great place to live, work, and raise a family, but we consistently rank in the bottom third for state health. Poor health choices and inactivity cost our state $54 billion a year, dollars that could be saved through healthier living. We can do better, North Carolina. That's why NC Spin is working with health and community organizations to launch a Healthier NC, an education campaign and challenge to live healthier lives. Join us at ahealthierNC.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
One of the best parts of our show, and one of the parts that people talk to me most about, is the segment of the show where we ask our panelists to tell us something we don't know. They get to choose the topic and sound off on it for a few seconds. So all of our panelists, tell us something we don't know. Joe Mav, I'll start with you.
Well, one of the quiet stars on Governor McCrory's staff is a fellow named Eric Guckian, Guckian. And Eric had a marvelous record when he was with Teach for America. And I think that we're going to begin to see his fingerprints on programs that bring teachers in bilateral entry to the classrooms of North Carolina.
Chris, tell us something we don't know.
Well, we talked earlier in the show about the opportunity scholarships or the voucher program passed this session by the General Assembly. There's another problem is emerging, which is there's no clear definition now between home schools and private schools in North Carolina, and even some Republican sponsors. Representative Hardister, who's one of the sponsors of the bill, is saying when they come back into session in the short session, they're going to have to address this. Otherwise, home schools are also going to be getting a tax credit they're not entitled to.
John, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, when Governor McCrory and legislative leaders and others came out against the idea of the Catawbas opening a casino in Cleveland County, people thought, well, that's the end of it. It's not even close to being the end of it. There's going to be federal litigation regardless of which way the federal government goes, and the Catawbas are arguing they don't need state permission under some arcane interactions of different federal laws. This is going to be an issue for years and years, and lots of lobbying and lots of litigation.
Jeanne, tell us something we don't know.
Commerce privatization. Some legislators are going to ask Attorney General Roy Cooper to look into the constitutionality of what's happening with what Secretary Decker and the governor are doing.
So what are they saying, that it's unconstitutional?
Right. Separation of powers.
Interesting. All right. Well, at this end of the year, very quickly around the horn, any final words as we move into the Christmas season?
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
That sums it up, I think, pretty well.
I disagree with that.
Yeah. If you're a legislator, don't tweet.
Next week, we're going to try to put some sense to all of this. You've heard our spin on the issues of the day. All of us at NC Spin sincerely hope you have a merry and safe Christmas. Next week, we hope you'll join us as we talk about the top stories of 2013 and look ahead to 2014. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.